Sorry, I just couldn't resist. Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez joins us this hour. He's the author of such Beatle tomes as Fab 4 FAQ and 2.0, 50 Fabulous Years, Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll, and Solo in the 70s. But just for a while, we're going to set aside his fine works about the Beatles and talk about our favorite books over the years about the Fab Four. So what I asked Robert to do, and what I've done, is pick our favorite four. So I've got my four written down here. Robert, have you got your four?
Yeah, pretty much at any given time, I kind of know, and it's not like I would say these are the four books to get as the most definitive, but maybe personal favorites, because we've got a history.
Right, so the books we're mentioning are not the greatest Beatle books ever. They're not the most historically accurate or the most informative. I mean, in some cases they are, but these are just our favorites. And Robert, you're the guest, so you go first.
Okay, let's start with Beatles Gear by Andy Babuik.
Yep, great book.
Andy, if you don't know him, he's a musician, professional musician, and has been going back for at least as far as the 80s. He's in the band the Chesterfield Kings, and he's got another band going on. But he's also like a real hardcore guitar nut for sure. But he also has the knowledge of, keyboards and drums and equipment and all this other stuff. And I'm thinking it was about 10 years ago, maybe a little less than that, that he did the first edition of Beatles Gear. And it is like the Bible of every instrument that ever passed through the Beatles' hands, going back to the Quarrymen days. Yeah. I mean, like the pictures you see of John Lennon at 15, 16, confronting the Quarrymen, the ones taking the day that he met Paul. That cheap little guitar he's got, this guy tracked it down, found out what the story was, where it was made, how much he paid for it, all that stuff. And he goes on to do that with every single instrument. And it's just fascinating. And I'm not, coming at this as a gearhead as far as guitars go and stuff like that.
Right.
I mean, I appreciate them as historic artifacts and these iconic things that you see in all these photos over the span of their career. And just the fact that, their humanity, went through the strings of those instruments into the boards and onto the records, and, same thing with Ringo and his drums. And so to me, it's like key to sort of understanding their artistry, how it was sort of influenced by the instruments that happened to be around, or back, when they reached the point in their careers where they could pick and choose, and, what instruments they would use in the studio from that point on, why they made choices that they did and how it influenced their sound. So he's put it all together, and it's just a fascinating, one-of-a-kind book. So that, I would absolutely have to be in my top four.
Yeah, we actually have that book at the station, and guests come by and flip through it. It's got beautiful photographs. It's a big coffee table book.
Yeah, right. It's a big, beautiful book. And like I said, I'm not such a hardcore guy that I need to know, what model was it, and what year was it made, and what plant, and all that stuff. I don't care about that stuff. But I can understand, because this comes through in the book, because he's a fan as well as a musician. And so he can really impart that excitement of, discovering, this is where they got that instrument on this day and what was going on in their career then. And, just really contextualize it, which I think is the most valuable trait a writer can bring to the table when they're doing a history of anything, is just put you, the reader, back in the times that, whatever history was being made, what was the context, what was going around the people that were creating it.
Interesting, because that's something of a reference book.
Right.
And those kind of books are predominantly the kind of Beatle books I like to read. But my first pick is actually a biography. It's called Lennon in My Life, and in paperback it was called The Beatles, Lennon and Me, written by Pete Shotton and Nicholas Schaffner.
Yes, really great.
Indeed, and I'm sure he'll come up a little later in this discussion.
Yes.
And believe it or not, this was the very first Beatle biography I ever read.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I was always more into reference books. Like the first Beatle book I ever got was All Together Now, the Castleman book. My mom bought that for me. And, because I wanted to read about the singles and the albums and all that sort of thing. But this is the first Beatle biography I ever read. And, of course, Pete Shotton was Lennon's schoolboy friend. So what you get in this book is a lot of stuff about Lennon's childhood, and he comes across as a Dennis the Menace type of character, and you can't help but love him.
Yes, absolutely. It was so unique when it came out, because nobody who knew them in the pre-fame days had really gone on at length in great detail about any of their childhoods and school life and all that stuff. And here he was, who better situated than Lennon's right-hand man for all those years through the Quarrymen, and even, beyond the Beatlemania years where he was still around and in their lives. And he was around, literally the day that Yoko and John got together as a couple for the first time.
Right.
So it's like what a great eye for detail, yet he's not so enamored of his subject that he can't write objectively. John was just a kid, a peer.
Yeah.
And he always, it's like with your siblings, you always, no matter how grown up you are, you always see them the way you did when you were first, developing a relationship.
And there was some good Beatle trivia in that book, too, like finding out where the line, yellow matter custard dripping from a dead dog's eye came from. It was a schoolboy chant about how lousy the cafeteria food was.
Yeah, like a playground little ditty, yeah.
And the whole Eleanor Rigby controversy. Lennon claimed in that David Sheff interview for Playboy in 1980 that he basically wrote most of Eleanor Rigby. Of course, we've always thought of it as a Paul song, and here Pete Shotton was there. And he says that Lennon barely contributed to it.
He flat out says how it was. And how dismissive John was of Pete's own input. And that was, how that song came into being, is that, Paul was soliciting input from whoever was in the room. Something that John, I guess, found insulting. It's like, how dare, you get advice from somebody who's not a songwriter in crafting this piece of work, But yeah, that's a great little vignette out of that book.
Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez joins us in this hour of the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop as we talk about some of our favorite books about the Beatles. And Robert, you're up next.
I would go with as a book that is a sentimental favorite and was hugely influential in its way upon me, was one of the first books I ever got my hands on. Back when I was becoming a fan in the 70s, as this kid, there wasn't this body of Beatle literature out there. You had to really scrounge around. And that was the Beatles Illustrated Record by Roy Carr and Tony Tyler.
Great
book. It just laid it all out. It put it in chronological order so you really understood their career arc and, what release followed what and how much of a step forward it represented, how the stuff was packaged and presented in Britain, in the Beatles country, because, of course, we had a very different experience here. And so that was an eye-opener because, you learn early on as an American fan how the stuff was sliced and diced. But here it was presented the way the Beatles intended, and that was a huge thing. And it was just the whole tone of the book. It's very arch, very sarcastic, and, definitely toward the solo years, you can tell who their favorites are and who they aren't. They particularly come down hard on George, which once I started getting into that music on my own, I started recognizing how unnecessarily mean they were being, just because you don't like the guy. They were so dismissive. Same thing with Paul in certain places. But it definitely influenced my sense of critical thinking about stuff and listening closely to things. And you could either accept their opinions or reject them. And, the more you develop your own sort of criteria, you can see where they might have just been going for the good line rather than giving you some useful criticism.
It's funny you bring that up because I've always been fascinated how over time perceptions change. Mm-hmm. And they're really harsh on Ram, Paul McCartney's Ram album in that book, right?
Right.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that now that's considered the classic McCartney solo album? Everybody talks about how great it is, and yet when it was released, it was considered the worst thing McCartney had ever done. In fact, some of those same people are probably now writing, high praise for that album. Mm-hmm. It's just interesting because you and I are around the same age, and when we were growing up, Sgt. Pepper was the Beatles album. That was their masterpiece, and now it's all changed. Now it's Revolver. That's the one everybody points to as, the masterpiece of a record.
Well, in looking at that reality of how the perceptions did change, I talk about this a bit in my Revolver book, the whole context of when Revolver came out in the summer of '66. All anybody wanted to talk about was not this great, bold leap forward, this semi-experimental album that they brought to America, the release the week that they came here to tour. All anybody wanted to talk about was, so, John, what did you mean when you said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus?
Exactly.
They got knocked completely off message. And by the time Pepper arrived, that was this major length of time they spent working on this thing. And so anticipation was building. People in the public were relieved that they weren't breaking up when the Strawberry Fields Penny Lane single came up because, back in those days, we weren't touring or cranking out the product constantly. It was as good as announcing that you were splitting up. And so there was reassurance that they were working on something. But they didn't have the competing bandwidth of Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys that year. They had the entire avenue to themselves. And so it was really a triumph of presentation and timing. Right. And I kind of recognize that it's sort of the victory lap after the triumph that was Revolver. that got sort of smothered beneath this ancillary stuff that had nothing to do with its contents. And also, I think that the revisionism, didn't it sort of coincide with the CD era?
Yes.
Where finally in America you got to hear the full 14-track release as presented by the Beatles, and not this 11-track abomination that they did to create Yesterday and Today.
I know I have some fans of the American albums that are probably wringing their hands right now, but it's true. The American version of Revolver, it's like John took a vacation or something.
Right, exactly. It's the only American album that has more George Harrison songs than John Lennon songs on it.
Right. My next book on the list is The Longest Cocktail Party.
Ooh, we have some overlap here.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right.
Go ahead.
I've always been fascinated with the mismanagement of Apple Records and how that office situation was, money flying out the window. I mean, we've heard all the stories, and most of the stories come from this book, actually. And because it was published so closely after Apple fell apart, this book came out in 1974, it definitely has a fly-on-the-wall feel to it because it just happened.
Yes, and especially with Richard DeLello's writing style. Anybody could have written about that period. It could have been very dry, or it could have been very journalistic. But he is, literally in the middle of everything going on, and he's the house hippie.
Yeah.
And he's coming at it with that perspective of this stoner American that's there to roll joints when he's not on official duty, and so that's the sort of surrealistic way that the book is presented. And it's literally like this episodic thing. It's just wonderful because you can really visualize what's happening from one, vignette to another in that.
Because it's written as diary entries.
Yes.
And I think even if you didn't have an interest in the Beatles, you could still appreciate this book just as a record of a company falling apart or, a bizarre office politics, if you wanted to read something like that. It's entertaining.
Yeah, or just like a little snapshot of the counterculture.
Yeah.
As it was, it started with all these great dreams and all this altruism, and just devolved into this chaos, but despite the best of intentions. And the four Beatles are so well presented there as their personality types. And you really get this fly on the wall perspective of what it was like to be one of their underlings and have to answer to four masters, in contradiction to each other.
And there's a part in the book that I like when Richard DeLello says, "I knew we were in trouble when Paul stopped coming around," because he was sort of the engine of that whole thing, at least originally.
Absolutely.
We're talking to Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez today as we discuss some of our favorite books about the Beatles, and, we had one there in common, so maybe we'll have the next one in common. Robert, you're up next.
Okay, well, that one aside, I would have to say what was mind-blowing for me when it came out was Mark Lewison's Beatles recording sessions.
Yep.
We had been kind of frustrated through the years, I think, when George Martin put out his book, and as a Beatles fan, you really want to know, how did they create that magic in the studio? What was it like? And I, in retrospect, as a grown-up, I can give George Martin his props for at least not inventing stuff when he penned his memoirs, and they're so scant on detail, and just they're not the fulfillment that you wanted as far as how they actually recorded the stuff, and how it all went down in the studio. So Mark Lewison's book, which was so incredibly detailed when it came out, I think in 1989, it just went through, I guess he was given access to the vaults and got to go through every bit of tape in there and all the logs. And so finally we had dates to connect with when things were done. And, oh, by the way, they did this many takes of this, and this master was spliced together from these multiple takes. And it was such a wealth of information, when that book came out. It really got people that were paying close attention to the Beatles' work. It gave them a new way of thinking about how they did what they did. And then that later on, Jeff Emmerich's book came out, and that's the one everybody looks at as like Holy Bible. It's so colorful and all the dialogue and all that stuff. I cannot look at that book as something to go to as a masterful reference. I mean, it is what it is. It's deeply flawed. And I've found interviews with Emmerich back in '79 where he says he can't remember anything.
Right.
And yet, lo and behold, 20 years later, his memory must have improved because now he's got this great best-selling book that is so vivid that gave the fans exactly what they wanted.
Right.
To me, it's the Lewison book that you have to go back to, even though it's not like anecdotal per se, but it did give you all this food for thought. Is like, oh, these are the things that are still in the vault. These takes exist. And that was something that we didn't really have anything authoritative to go on to that point.
And an unintended consequence of that book was that it was a gift to bootleggers.
Yes.
Because finally they could identify all these various different takes,
And that was also, I think the guy's name was John Barrett, was the guy at EMI that was dying of cancer that was going through the vaults, I guess concurrent with Lewisman's work on that. And suddenly the floodgates were open, all this stuff got spirited out, and you had the whole Yellow Dog series of this pristine studio quality, multiple takes of things, that was just unimaginable not that long before. In the 70s, when anything from the studio that might be new to listeners' ears was either really rough sounding, terrible quality, or it wasn't even the Beatles at all.
Right.
Like Have You Heard the Word,
exactly.
or, Ellis Bumblebee, just stuff that kind of was sort of Beatles-like, and you can get away with throwing it out there because, who's going to contradict you?
Right. And what a glorious time that was when those floodgates opened.
My God.
In terms of collecting unreleased stuff. And I still know people that bought all their Beatle bootlegs in the 1970s, and they'll say, oh, well, the sound quality's not that great, but it's all we have. And, well, that's all you had in 1973. By 1989, a completely different story. In fact, the bootleg stuff sounded better than what was on the shelves.
And then the second wave was come Rock Band. And then all of a sudden, this stuff is coming out with the isolated tracks, like isolated vocals, isolated bass, isolated drums, isolated guitar. It was just amazing. And once again, you got an even greater sense of these guys, of how good they were in the studio. Hearing, when it made the rounds a year or two ago of the isolated vocals from side 2 of Abbey Road.
Yes.
How breathtakingly amazing.
So I think that brings us to my second to last on my list. And it's also the most recent book on this list, and it's The Unreleased Beatles Music and Film by Richie Unterberger.
Good book.
And basically what he does here is he goes through all of the unreleased material and kind of curates it for you and describes the, not only the sound quality, but the quality of the performance and, if it's interesting and worth seeking out.
Right.
And I guess he used Mark Lewison's book as sort of a way to put it all together,
sure.
Because he had the dates.
Now you got a skeleton, and now you're adding flesh to the bones. Yeah.
Right.
Take seven.
We're talking with Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop as we discuss some of our favorite books, not necessarily the best, but just ones we've always liked over the years about the Beatles. And Robert, I think this is your last one coming up here.
Let's see. Well, we had coincided with the one, so let's see, 1, 2, 3. I guess this would be my last one, my fourth. Okay. And this was, again, pure sentimental favorite. It's one that I know now, as a grown-up, and as somebody that's been researching the Beatles for years, how much a lot of it is just pure nonsense, pure myth-making. But as an entertaining read, and it's, this is the reason why people read novels, is like it gives them like a hyper-realistic version of real life, that you get the gist of the emotional truth of what it's telling. And that book, for me, is The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, by Alan Williams and Bill Marshall.
Yep.
Yeah. And that, I know so much stuff in there is just hyperbole, to be kind about it, but it is such a vivid depiction of them in what really might be their most fascinating phase, where they were becoming the Beatles. From these nobodies, disrespected by everyone in Liverpool, and then they go to Hamburg, and then they suddenly become this powerhouse, and they come back to Liverpool and Cavern and, just start knocking people dead. All this pre-EMI stuff. And there's some other little stories in there, little sides, like when he found the Star Club tapes, Alan Williams did in like 1973, and he tries to interest Apple in them, and he goes to visit George, who takes a pass, but then gives him some uncut rubies as compensation for years of not squaring things with him.
Right.
So it's just a great, vivid book that, they've made now how many movies about the early days of the Beatles? You have Birth of the Beatles, you have Backbeat, you got Nowhere Boy. Every one of them falls short as far as I'm concerned.
Yep. Somebody
needs to make a movie out of The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away.
And again,
just as a comedy, it would work.
Yeah, if you're looking for a fun read, you can't go wrong with that book.
Right.
Now, that brings me to, I guess this will be the last one. There's a battle raging inside me here.
Ooh,
and I'm going to tell you the one that I'm not going to put on my list, and that's Get Back, the Let It Be Disaster by Doug Sulpy and Ray Schweigert.
Yes.
It's actually more entertaining than the Get Back sessions themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. It gets right to the meat of it.
Right. And it's a book that exonerates Paul in a lot of ways. But I'm going to go with a book where the Beatles really aren't the main focus of the book. It's Growing Up with the Beatles.
I knew it.
1980.
Yeah,
Rob
Ron
Schomburg.
Schomburg.
Oh, man. This book is kind of like an episode of The Wonder Years with the Beatles providing the soundtrack.
Yes.
Yeah.
He sort of precursed the Wonder Years, is like putting
Sure
something in
did.
book form before there was such a thing.
Yeah.
It really is this transition from this, geeky little kid, going through the whole pangs of adolescence and then, into adulthood, with all his disappointment along the way, and I made a rotten hippie and all this stuff. And it's not only a reflection of the universality of being this awkward kid transitioning into adulthood, but also of the 60s and what it was like when, it starts out, the 60s begin as, sort of this hangover from the Eisenhower years and go through this major upheaval by the end of the decade. What it was like to grow up and have to change along with the times to stay up with it. It works on that level as well. But it's one of those books that came out, and again, going back to the 70s when there wasn't a whole lot out there, the book that kind of superseded it was Nicholas Schaffner's Beatles Forever.
Oh, yeah. Another one that almost made the list.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. A wonderful book. I mean, to this day, there's still this tone of reverence, whenever people discuss that book, because it's so well written. It's so accessible. It's not only just the Beatle years, but also going into the solo years up till 77 when it was published. And it's just a really, really enjoyable read.
Yeah, one of my favorite books, and written from an American fan's perspective, much like growing up with the Beatles. And it's a necessity. You have to have that in your Beatles library. We're going to talk about the Beatles in the 70s, the solo years, in just a few short minutes with Robert Rodriguez. But I need to play this song for Maureen. She requested this one. Here's All You Need Is Love. We've been talking to Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez, and he's got a new book out called Solo in the 70s. And Robert, I'm so glad you're writing about this time period, because if you buy any biography of the individual Beatles, at least 75% of the book is dedicated to a retelling of what happened in the 60s.
Right.
And their solo careers get short shrift. And some great work was done in the 70s, and it's not to be dismissed.
No, not at all. And I think that, once again, as we talked about the Ram album, it's the hindsight that really reveals how important this work was. You could say that among any number of the albums that were made, they made between 1970 and 1980, there's 30 albums of original Beatles solo material during that decade. You consider John was only active for the first 5 years. That's a ton of material that you can't just be cavalier about and dismiss as like, oh, this is, it's not worthy of our attention because it's not the Beatles. This is their taking the artistic legacy that they created in the Beatles and going off in their own artistic, their individual identities as artists that they had to sort of, come to terms with, who am I outside the Beatles? And, tracing that journey is very fascinating. You see when they're, separated from each other, what it was that they contribute to the greater whole, when their own musicality is out in the forefront without, being blurred by the Beatles working around them, although certainly there were certain projects that they did have more than one Beatle on during that era.
And will there be a follow-up to this book?
That's something that people ask me about, and to me there's like from 1981 through, let's say arbitrarily make it 20 years, goes to the death of George in 2001. There's tons of things to talk about there. There's Paul's resurgence as a solo artist, and then his tours. There's Ringo finding his renaissance, starting with Time Takes Time, and then the Mark Hudson produced stuff, and the all-star bands, certainly the Traveling Wilburys, the resurgence of Apple, putting out this archival stuff, first the BBC, then the anthologies, and all that stuff. There's tons to talk about. And, that would be something that would be a major undertaking for anybody to do. I've certainly thought about it, but, it's a matter of wanting to commit myself to really doing it justice. And, that's a lot of years we're talking, a lot of recorded material, especially from Paul, who throws out entire albums worth of non-album tracks, and all his spin-offs, the Fireman and, the classical stuff he's done. So I would do it if I felt I could do it justice, and then it may take some time to do.
Well, you're a young guy,
Thanks.
You have many years ahead of you. Robert, it's been great talking to you, and where can people catch up with what you're doing these days? I know you do have a podcast.
Yes, I have a podcast called somethingaboutthebeatles.com, one word, and we do those, me and author Richard Buskin, who's a journalist from England who lives in Chicago now, and so we've been doing those things. We try to do one at least once a month. We've got a new one coming up in a couple of days on songs the Beatles gave away. So that's one thing. I'm on Facebook as Fab4FAQ2. Just look for my page there. And then everything else, my sort of catch-all website is revolverbook.com. It's not just Revolver. It's like all my books and interviews and library appearances and all that sort of thing. So you can find it all there.
All right. And thanks so much for coming on with us. And I have a feeling we'll be doing it again really, really soon.
Thank you so much. Take care.